Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. No warning preceded the rupture. A muted groan pressed through the soil, a shiver that passed unnoticed through reinforced walls, through boots scuffing polished concrete, through fingertips brushing clipboard edges. Lights overhead shivered on their cables, unnoticed by those clocking out after another 12-hour shift. Beneath the southern annex, where no blueprints showed anything older than poured concrete, the ground slumped inward like the chest of a breathless man. Earth pulled itself apart, revealing angles too precise to be natural, a void squared off by human hands that should never have touched that depth. Dust billowed through the service tunnels. Alarms keened without rhythm. Men and women staggered from break rooms and stairwells, squinting into thickening air, coughing, covering faces with sleeves soaked in sweat. Radios crackled with commands clipped short by static. Somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the chaos of evacuation orders and the drag of boots against stone, something older than every plan ever drawn for this place waited in silence. Survey teams deployed within an hour. Small machines, boxy and blinking with cautious red lights, inched toward the breach. Cameras fed grainy images back to control centers where no one dared to speak above a whisper. On cracked monitors, the chamber emerged piece by piece, a rectangle etched in cold geometry, surfaces clean as a scalpel's edge, corners that met with surgical precision. Not a trace of debris within. No signs of life, no movement. Only the crushing certainty that this structure had waited there long before the first concrete mixer rolled across Geneva's border. Radiation sensors whined low, a background hum sharp enough to tighten jaws and fists. Levels beyond ordinary decay, but shy of lethal thresholds. Just enough to discourage curiosity without commanding fear. Theorists pulled from their beds threw on wrinkled shirts, coffee staining the pages of hastily opened manuals. Cold War relic, someone muttered. A Soviet bunker left forgotten beneath the soil, tucked in by error or by intention. Loose talk filled sterile hallways. No one quite willing to ask why Soviet engineers would build here, long before CERN ever broke ground. Rumors moved faster than orders. Men in maintenance uniforms whispered about warning lights seen weeks ago, anomalies in ground-penetrating radar dismissed as calibration errors. Names not on rosters wandered through those conversations. Old physicists, forgotten projects, facilities long since decommissioned. No single story took root, but every man and woman who looked into that void carried away the same image. A place built with certainty, a place abandoned without sign of struggle or decay, a place that had no business existing at all. Excavation halted without ceremony. Barriers rose overnight. Sterile plastic sheeting stretched across ancient stone like gauze across a wound no surgeon dared suture. Outside those walls, the particle accelerators hummed through their scheduled calibrations, collisions counted by machines designed to ignore everything except what they were told to find. Inside the breach, however, nothing obeyed. Instruments twitched. Measurements refused to repeat. The air itself carried weight, not pressure measurable by any gauge, but something subtler, heavier, a pressure that shifted behind the ribs and prickled across scalps. Inside command centers scrubbed clean of speculation, a single question pulsed without voice across every screen, every clenched jaw, every sleepless stare toward the monitors. Who built a room beneath a facility that did not yet exist, and why had it waited until now to be found? Metal braces groaned under the weight of uncertainty. Pneumatic seals pressed against a doorway untouched by human hands, their hiss lost in the silence swallowing the chamber. No light leaked from the breach. No cold breath of trapped air brushed against exposed skin. Only an absence so complete it gnawed at the edges of thought. Protective suits crinkled as bodies moved through the gap. Boots crunched against loose gravel, an alien sound against the raw hush stretched across the hollow space. Flashlights darted along the walls, beams swallowed faster than they should have been by surfaces that refused to reflect warmth. Inside, a laboratory frozen outside of time revealed itself with brutal clarity. Analog equipment lined the walls. Cathode ray oscilloscopes, switchboard computers fat with vacuum tubes, dials marked by hand in fading ink. No monitors, no microchips, no digital pulses humming beneath the skin of machines. Everything built by a hand that had once trusted weight, resistance, imperfection. At the center, desks sat in uneven rows, each covered in neatly stacked papers, yellowed but unmarked by mold or dust. Typewritten notes mapped energy signatures with notations in languages both familiar and forgotten. Pens lay precisely aligned beside ledgers, whose bindings cracked softly when pages were turned. Chalkboards bolted to iron frames carried particle trajectories drawn in painstaking arcs, calculations curling into margins as if the authors had run out of time or nerve. Across one far wall, a corkboard stretched from floor to ceiling, pinned with hundreds of names in a careful hand. Each name accompanied by a date written with unshaking precision, dates stretching forward 50 years, some still a decade distant. A few observers recognized titles among them. Prizes awarded for breakthroughs yet unborn, discoveries still locked in untested theories whispered in faculty lounges. Questions crowded into throats dry with fear. No signs of entry or forced exit. No protective fields shielding the chamber. No cryogenic systems humming behind walls. Only silence, only machinery waiting with a patience no living mind could bear for long. Gloved fingers hovered above control panels, hesitant to touch. Screens too archaic for modern hands stared back blankly. A thin layer of stillness clung to everything, not dust, not decay, but a quiet that pressed against skin, seeping into the folds of fabric, crawling behind the ribs. Initial reports spoke cautiously, voices pitched low over radios. No hazards detected. Radiation levels within tolerances. Mechanical integrity sound. Recommendations urged caution, further study, minimal disturbance. Yet even as orders flowed through clean channels, eyes betrayed a creeping certainty shared by every soul who crossed the threshold. Nothing inside belonged to the world outside. No relic could have survived unguarded without corrosion, entropy, erasure. No craftsman could have carved such precision without leaving the imprint of age, of fatigue, of error. Walls bore no markings. Floors showed no scuffs. Air tasted wrong, dry but sharp, metallic in a way no ventilation could explain. Some speculated the place had never been sealed, had never needed to be. As if what had been built beneath the earth had folded itself against time's teeth, refusing decay not by resistance but by absence. Still, the survey continued. Cameras documented every angle. Diagrams lifted into scanners that stuttered, hiccuped, refused to read. Machines built to categorize and file data into neat boxes struggled to define the crude simplicity laid out before them. Later, in conference rooms draped in sleepless light, scientists would replay those first images again and again, searching for clues missed in the moment. They would count the names on the corkboard, cross-reference them against histories not yet written, and fail to find a single error. They would sift through particle charts that mapped energies never yet measured, and realize the predictions mirrored patterns no one living had theorized until years after CERN's first stones had been set. Yet none of those futures mattered in the chamber's presence. There, where only the hum of strained breathing filled the air, the weight of recognition anchored every movement. A room existed without history, without creator, without explanation. It had waited, not to be found, but to be entered. Something in its silence suggested that discovery had not been an accident. The breach had not opened under human hands. It had opened because it had decided its time had come. Laboratories that usually pulsed with noise fell into an uneasy hush. Machines processed samples under harsh lights while technicians huddled at the edges of the rooms, watching displays crawl with data that refused to make sense. Carbon markers pulled from paper fibers, copper wire, steel supports told a story no one had asked to hear. Construction dated back to decades before excavation broke ground for the collider. Some samples aged even earlier, as if plucked from eras when particle physics existed only in whispers among mathematicians staring into candlelight. Reports flooded across secured channels, numbers annotated with triple checks and initials no longer reassuring. Spectrometry mapped chemical signatures inconsistent with any recorded supply chains. No modern compounds traced to known manufacturing. Ink formulas matched nothing on global registries. Wood in the clipboards, fibers in the worn lab coats folded neatly over abandoned chairs, pointed back to forests felled long before Europe's borders settled into their current shape. Geological scans deepened the wound. Surveys showed sediment layers compressed naturally around the chamber's frame, unbroken, undisturbed, no sign of backfill or artificial tampering. The ground had grown around it as if the structure had rooted itself long before human hands shaped the land above. No seismic disruption, no construction scars. Just the silent fact of existence without cause. Command centers filled with bodies pressed too close together. Screens bled green and amber against faces pulled tight with disbelief. White bards became battlegrounds, timelines rewritten, theories stretched until voices cracked from argument. Some pushed for disclosure, arguing that truth carried its own gravity, that knowledge once unearthed could not be reburied without consequence. Others, faces grayed by decades spent navigating grants and politics, warned of destabilization, ridicule, fear. If word leaked that CERN, the monument to human achievement, stood atop an impossible relic, public trust could erode in days. Funding could wither. Allies could splinter. Private meetings unfolded behind locked doors. Legal teams scribbled drafts of statements never meant to be read. Drafts grew heavier with each new discovery, each confirmation that no rational timeline could reconcile the evidence. External consultants were summoned quietly, experts in Cold War counterintelligence, in suppressed histories, in manufactured narratives. Meanwhile, those who had walked through the breach carried a different burden. Memory of the chamber pressed against their senses like humidity before a summer storm. Dreams blurred with waking moments. Equations burned behind closed eyelids. Disagreements sharpened into rifts not easily mended by policy or protocol. Pressure built without explosion. Low murmurs filled cafeterias, empty corridors, shuttle buses slipping through pre-dawn fog. Whispers of suppression bred resentment. Accusations bloomed behind polite smiles. Loyalty shifted from institution to ideal, to the raw, aching need to understand what had been found without permission. No formal decisions emerged, only compromises dressed in silence. Official orders stalled the survey. Further data collection postponed indefinitely pending review. Staff rotations shuffled those closest to the discovery into quieter roles, diluted their influence by scattering them across continents. Yet no administrative shuffling could erase the question lodged behind every glance at every sealed report, every email sent with hands hesitating above the send key. If the room had waited without witness for generations, how many more were buried, unseen, shaping foundations thought secure? And if this chamber had built itself into the bones of CERN without human knowledge, what hand had placed it there, and how long had it been writing futures not yet lived? Translation teams worked in rooms kept colder than necessary, as if temperature alone could slow the disquiet running under every heartbeat. Pages lifted from the chamber's desks were treated like artifacts from a lost civilization. Gloves traced margins worn thin by hands no one could identify. Magnifiers tilted toward inks that bled slightly where pressure had lingered longest. Languages bled into one another across the note. French laced through Russian formulas. German annotations wrapped themselves around Italian diagrams. Occasional English, dry and clinical, footnoted experiments that no institution had yet attempted. No consistency of grammar or style, as if multiple minds, separated by distance and time, had poured themselves into the same project without ever touching. Early translations surfaced patterns unnoticed at first glance. Collision scenarios scribbled in shorthand matched no current experimental runs. Particle behaviors outlined in the margins showed unstable patterns, decays within decays, phenomena outside the standard model. Energy levels annotated in trembling script dwarfed anything achievable by the collider's present design, energies that should have torn the containment fields apart within seconds. Some diagrams mapped lattice formations spinning out from theoretical particles never catalogued, their interactions rippling into predictions that bent accepted physics. Others hinted at energy anomalies that twisted spatial orientations, interactions more suited to mathematical abstractions than laboratory report. Cross-referencing these notes with documented experiments painted a more troubling picture. Events listed casually in the chamber's files aligned with real-world discoveries made long after the supposed construction date. The Higgs boson, mapped with an eerie precision decades before its confirmation. Neutrino oscillations predicted not merely as theory but with energy bands and timing windows later measured in controlled conditions. Investigators double-checked, then triple-checked. Test samples were seeded into analysis programs to bait confirmation bias. Randomized datasets meant to flush out retrofitted interpretations came back with consistency too sharp to dismiss. The chamber's data did not generalize or guess. It recorded specifics. Energies, decay rates, particle spin behaviors not yet achieved even by theoretical simulations. Some questioned whether notes had been planted after the discoveries. Security sweeps found no tampering. Paper dating matched original conclusions. Chemical signatures remained unchanged. Even bacterial degradation patterns on the ink matched age estimates, placing the creation of these documents long before the phenomena they described had been observed. Tension leaked into every corner of the facility. Casual conversations grew brittle. Side glances at hallways once traveled without thought lingered too long. Every reading session ended with silence heavier than argument, a silence woven from threads no official statement could untangle. The realization spread not through shouted revelation but by the slow tightening of thought. Someone or something had recorded events before they happened, not by probability, not by projection, but by description, as if memory had been laid down in advance of experience. Each passing day eroded the belief that the room represented an accident of time or physics. Too much precision, too much familiarity with outcomes never yet born. Some began to understand that the chamber had not merely existed to be found. It had been placed where discovery would be inevitable once certain milestones had been reached. It had been waiting for humanity to catch up to instructions already written, instructions that did not ask permission, did not offer explanation, only described what would come next as if the future had already collapsed into the past. And buried within the notes, stitched quietly between the equations and trajectories, waited plans too complex for immediate comprehension, plans that hinted at constructions and experiments far beyond what the collider had been built to withstand. Whether warning or invitation remained unread, trapped in ink on brittle paper, while above ground, the earth turned without pause, carrying those who had seen too much into a tomorrow already mapped without their consent. Sleep grew thin across the corridors nearest the restricted sectors. Offices that once cleared out by nightfall stayed lit into small hours, curtains half drawn, faces half shaved, eyes burning against white paper and failing monitors. No memos passed. No meetings summoned. Still, patterns emerged. Drafting tables filled with sketches none recalled starting. Equations stretched across whiteboards and symbols half-formed before the conscious mind caught up. Fingertips stained with graphite smudged formulas into margins of printed reports, into conference folders, into napkins abandoned beside untouched meals. Dreams no longer belonged to private hours. Sequences of numbers surfaced in morning routines, slipped through conversations without invitation. Rooms carried the faint pressure of purpose stronger than conversation, heavier than fatigue. Those assigned to the chamber's study found hands moving before instruction, eyes narrowing on patterns missed by every automated system. Psychological reviews ordered in quiet failed to explain the convergence. Test scores shifted across departments with unnerving precision. Creativity spiked within narrow bands aligned precisely with the chamber's content. Reasoning faculties sharpened where acceleration of experimental parameters could be justified, dulled where caution might intervene. Reports documented shared experiences unacknowledged aloud. Dreams laced with impossible architectures, particle arrays spinning beyond Euclidean framing, designs of devices bearing no resemblance to sanctioned projects. Waking hours blurred into those visions, gestures unconsciously sketching invisible diagrams in the air before fading back into habitual restraint. Medical screenings flagged stress markers without clear source. Cortisol levels rose, sleep cycles collapsed into irregular fragments, yet no clear cases of psychosis emerged. Instead, minds grew tuned to frequencies unfamiliar yet coherent, focused not by external command but by an interior compulsion aligned across individuals with no prior history of collaboration. Attempts to isolate staff members by rotation only worsened the effect. Displaced researchers carried fragments of dreams with them, seeding equations into unrelated fields, finding application for anomalies that had no business appearing in unrelated projects. Security logs revealed patterns before administration admitted them. Unauthorized access not for sabotage or theft, but for gathering scraps of data, incomplete schematics, failed calculations discarded months earlier. Storage servers recorded bursts of activity during off-hours, file trees reconstructed from deleted fragments, each reconstruction moving closer to configurations described in the chamber's note. Some supervisors requested reassignment. Some resigned without warning, documents unsigned, badges abandoned at security desk. Those who stayed grew harder to reach, their speech peppered with references to energy thresholds, to collision frequencies whispered as if recalling a childhood prayer. No accusations were made. No punishments handed down. Only a silent tightening of observation, a growing unease neither recognized fully nor dared name. The chamber had not simply been discovered. Its presence had reached beyond stone and lead, weaving itself into thought, into ambition, into the instinctive grasping toward thresholds not yet crossed. Machines built by human hands still answered to keystrokes and voice commands, but the minds behind those commands shifted imperceptibly with each passing hour, inching toward a goal never spoken, a design never consciously chosen. Within the silence of labs and empty meeting rooms, blueprints not written by living memory assembled themselves in scattered fragments, awaiting only a hand confident enough to put them together. The conference room ceilings seemed lower during those weeks, though no renovation crews had passed through. Air vents rattled slightly against closed windows. Noises once dismissed as mechanical hums took on a sharper texture, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the shifting of shoulders, the tapping of pens, the restless glances toward digital clocks counting hours no longer trusted. Arguments no longer waited for closed doors. Raised voices cracked against sterile walls, language fraying from technical precision into guttural commands and accusations. On one side, a gathering of minds framed the chamber as inevitable design. To find a roadmap embedded beneath the earth, to discover instructions more accurate than any living physicist could claim, could not be dismissed as accident. Those pages had waded across impossible spans not to be hidden, but to be followed. Completion was not hubris, they whispered among themselves, it was fulfillment, an obligation written into the very foundation of progress. Delay would only compound ignorance. Fear would only deny what had already been granted. Opposite them, a quieter but equally sharp resistance formed. Voices speaking with careful, brittle calm. History, they reminded, was littered with discoveries too powerful for the civilizations that unearthed them. To act on instructions without knowing the hand that wrote them risked not only personal ruin, but alterations to reality itself too subtle, too permanent to correct. If the chamber was a test, they argued, perhaps refusal was the only passing grade. Perhaps preservation demanded abstinence. Meetings once scheduled weekly metastasized into daily confrontations. Security details thickened around laboratories once considered open to any credentialed staff. Clearance levels shifted overnight. Keycards failed without warning. Protocols designed for external threats turned inward, monitoring colleagues with the same suspicion once reserved for foreign intelligence. Private friendships thinned under the pressure. Conversations sharpened into interrogations masked by collegial phrasing. New alliances formed across departments previously hostile, not through ideology, but through a shared, private certainty that neutrality had become impossible. Internal memos took on a different cadence, lines weighted with meanings not written. Invitations to confidential projects arrived without sender identification. Requests for collaboration masked under harmless research topics revealed themselves, upon closer inspection, to be vectors pulling trusted hands toward the chamber's unfinished blueprints. The particle accelerators continued their scheduled calibrations. Collision logs accumulated in databases too large for human review. Yet those with clearance to access deeper files noticed deviations in experiment parameters, requests filed with forged signatures, adjustments too precise to be accidental. Tension crept outward from the core teams. Support staff rotated through assignments faster than schedules could predict. Training protocols adjusted to monitor psychological resilience. Those showing hesitation found themselves transferred to distant offices, their concerns buried under layers of bureaucracy until memory faded into administrative dust. Within the heart of the facility, no consensus remained, only a rift widening by inches each day, measured not by words or policies but by the choices shaping experiments, shaping thought, shaping the willingness to proceed without certainty. Beyond the debates, beyond the bruised reputations and silent dismissals, a fact loomed too large to ignore. The chamber had already begun its work. Whether welcomed or resisted, its presence had seeded a decision that could not be postponed indefinitely. Either the path would be followed or it would be broken. In either case, no one could claim ignorance when the final step arrived. Corridors that once hummed with orderly transit fell into a strange silence after midnight, broken only by the soft pressure of footsteps moving against concrete without urgency. Lights above service tunnels flickered low, programmed into cost-saving cycles, casting long shadows against steel partitions and stacked crates. In an unlisted wing, behind doors requiring no official clearance, a handful of hands moved with rehearsed precision. Nothing spoken above a whisper. Nothing recorded beyond the tremble of air displaced by movement. Equipment assembled piece by piece from decommissioned parts, scavenged systems repurposed from abandoned experiments, cooled and shielded in ways not approved by any committee. Blueprints copied in secret sprawled across workbenches, their lines too precise to permit improvisation. Calculations had narrowed themselves into certainties that left no room for hesitation. Alignment fields checked, superconductors primed under cryogenic seals assembled with quiet defiance. A single terminal monitored the sequence, an interface patched together from outdated firmware, humming low against an empty room. Final calibrations submitted not through committee, but through a hand steady in its conviction that waiting had never been part of the instruction. Activation slipped into the system without ceremony. No alarms triggered. No sirens screamed across the concrete halls. Within a breath, containment fields engaged, accelerator rings pulsed with compressed energy, and the device completed its first full cycle. No explosions. No surges. No visual confirmation that anything at all had shifted. Except for the instrument. Clocks synced across independent servers lost fractions of seconds without clear cause, discrepancies rippling across time-stamped data like a tremor running under polished floors. Gravimetric sensors installed far from the collider's axis registered weight anomalies at microscopic scales, blips that slipped between program thresholds, neither error nor malfunction, but undeniable shifts in local mass. Temperature probes recorded minor fluctuations impossible under stable atmospheric conditions. Subatomic particle counters misaligned by margins too slim for mechanical failure yet too broad for natural drift. Outside the containment chamber, those tasked with maintenance felt the change not with instruments, but with the hairs rising along forearms, the sudden dry taste at the back of the throat, the brief hesitation before crossing thresholds once passed without thought. Data flooded into isolated terminals. Logs duplicated without instruction. Backups triggered without human command. Redundant systems failed to register the duplication as abnormal. Above ground, wind patterns shifted against tree lines usually mapped with obsessive precision. Birds broke formation, clusters scattering without predator presence. Electrical hums along power relays thickened into low vibrations barely heard yet felt along spines pressed against chair back. Within the unauthorized chamber, no celebration marked the activation. No hand reached out in triumph. Those present understood without speaking that something had crossed a boundary too subtle to announce itself, but too permanent to deny. Measurements would be dismissed at first, anomalies blamed on calibration errors, data corruption, environmental drift. Corrections would be filed. Reports rewritten. Surface operations would resume under the illusion of continuity. Beneath that facade, something fundamental had shifted, not in spectacle, but in the quiet, certain realignment of rules once thought immutable. Physics, once trusted to cradle human understanding, had blinked. The chamber had not needed force to alter the world. It had only needed compliance. And compliance had been given. Return to the chamber came with a weight no briefing could erase. Those sent through the breach moved slower without acknowledging it, eyes dragging across surfaces catalogued 100 times before, now uncertain of what might meet them. Breaths shortened, shoulders tensed without instruction. Instruments whined low against the tight press of recycled air. At first glance, nothing appeared different. The same analog equipment stood in place, the same rows of battered desks, the same chalkboards carved with particle arcs too perfect to be accidental. Yet movement within the corners of vision betrayed the lie. Where once drawers sat swollen shut with humidity and age, some now hung ajar. Cabinets bolted to the walls bore new keys in locks once rusted shut. Clipboards clattered to concrete floors with a hollowness suggesting unfamiliar weight. Inside those drawers, where only dust had lain during the first surveys, folders bloomed thick with diagrams. Blueprints sharper, more intricate, technical languages spliced together with symbols never taught in any university. Margins once scrawled with human error now showed linework so exact it strained comprehension. Schematics detailed devices beyond even the unauthorized construction. Particle configurations mapped into matrices no current collider could simulate. Energy field regulators designed for tolerances surpassing known materials. Instructions annotated with timing cycles synchronized not to atomic clocks, but to unknown decay signatures vibrating just beyond measurable reality. Machines themselves bore alterations. Switchboards displayed configurations out of place with previous photograph. Oscilloscopes registered frequencies too precise to match their original manufacturing capabilities. Dials clicked into positions without manual adjustment, as if internal calibrations had shifted overnight without external power or interference. Survey teams tasked with documenting the changes logged discrepancies until their hands shook against datapad. Some argued memory played tricks under pressure. Others whispered of sabotage. Yet fingerprints matched the original dustings. Material compositions aligned with previous samples. No evidence of human tampering surfaced, only the quiet, methodical rearrangement of a place that had no reason to change. Those who stayed long enough within the chamber felt alterations not just in equipment but in the air itself. A slow tension pressed against skin, a warping of space perceptible only at the edges of awareness. Metal surfaces carried a faint vibration unregistered by instruments. Shadows leaned slightly against geometry rather than light, angles growing subtly unfamiliar the longer eyes lingered. Psychologists brought in under security clearances too high to trace recorded minor cognitive distortions among returning personnel. Short-term memory failures, temporal disorientation, recollections of objects shifting places between blink. No clear patterns, no decisive failures of mental faculties, only a collective fraying at the margins of perceived normalcy. Analysis units tasked with data verification crashed without reproducible cause. Error logs filled with timecodes out of sequence. Backups restored only to reveal subtle variations from originals, variations confirmed across independent systems. It became undeniable that the chamber had not been static. The breach had not merely uncovered a forgotten relic. The act of discovery had triggered interaction. The unauthorized activation had invited response. Every attempt to document or understand only deepened the dislocation. Measurements slipped with each pass. Architectural schematics no longer matched walls that should have been immutable. Air pressure ratios shifted against predictions. Magnetic field mappings distorted along axes that refused to obey planetary alignment. Reality around the chamber adjusted itself with a patience both alien and inexorable, not in grand displays of rupture or collapse, but through fine-grained mutations woven into the architecture of perception, into the mechanics of certainty itself. The room had not been left behind as a warning or gift. It had been waiting not for explorers to find it, but for an action bold enough to justify its next move. Waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting for consent, however unspoken. And consent, once given, could not be withdrawn. Changes began so small that even calibrated instruments missed them at first. A rounding error here, a drift in synchronized time signals there, anomalies too minute for alarms but enough to unsettle those whose lives depended on precision. Deep space observatories logged inconsistencies in photon arrival times. Atomic clocks at separate observatories, synchronized within nanoseconds for decades, began to drift by margins previously considered impossible without mechanical failure. Biological labs across continents reported anomalies in cell cultures thought immune to environmental factors. Replication cycles shortened in ways no known mutation could explain. Energy absorption rates in proteins deviated slightly from textbook models. Tissue samples preserved for control groups exhibited structures microscopically inconsistent with genetic expectations, as if fundamental constants of chemistry itself had shifted by a hair's breadth. In geological surveys, radiometric decay rates no longer aligned with historic baselines. Long-term projections for isotope behavior faltered, predictions once reliable to scientific certainty bending under stresses no human could name. No catastrophes erupted. No cities crumbled. No skies split apart under strange stars. Supermarkets opened on schedule. Trains moved along their rails. Children laughed along playground fences dusted with the breath of late autumn. Yet beneath every surface, every calculation, every assumed constant, a quiet divergence grew without hesitation. Reports filed in classified archives told a different story. Engineers recalibrating optical systems found light behaving with marginally altered velocities depending on directionality, as if local spacetime had thickened imperceptibly along preferred axes. Military satellites lost minor degrees of synchronization, correcting without human command, compensating for distortions none could explain without acknowledging forces that did not belong to any known physics. Inside cloistered scientific circles, those who dared speak aloud began to whisper a conclusion so fragile it threatened reason itself. The chamber had not preserved observations of a future unfolding naturally. It had not documented probabilities or projected trends. It had written the future. The future observed had been built backward into history's root, a scaffolding so fine no human hand had recognized it being drawn until the moment construction began without conscious choice. Completion of the device, activation of the forgotten machine, had not broken reality but adjusted it, like a painter darkening a corner of a canvas not yet finished. A process ongoing. A process slow enough that resistance would bleed away across generations before anyone grasped fully what had shifted. What had been constants became variables, invisible to daily life but inevitable in cumulative weight. No instruments could measure intent. No theories yet formulated could explain design layered into phenomena thought inviolate. Some understood. Those who had walked through the original breach. Those who had touched the papers with hands that trembled not from fear but from the aching knowledge of complicity. The chamber had waited because waiting ensured participation. Waiting ensured consent disguised as discovery. Waiting ensured that once the process began, it would be irreversible. Across 1,000 laboratory basements, across oceans, across cities waking beneath indifferent skies, the adjustment moved forward, not in violence but in silent certainty. No one would announce the change. No one would be able to remember a world before it. Because the world before it had never truly existed. Only the room had existed. Only the room would endure. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.